It started with a poll, a small one on LinkedIn. The setup was simple. You earn $120,000 a year, you're looking for a new job, and you have to choose between two ways of paying a career consultant. Option 1, $500 upfront, a package of services, no guarantees. Option 2, $10,000 as a success fee, paid only if you accept an offer. Within a day, 1,174 people had voted. 85% chose the second model. When you first see that number, the instinct is to read it as financial literacy. Paying for a result sounds safer than paying for a process that might end in nothing. But the moment you sit with the arithmetic, the picture starts to shift. $500 is an amount you can spread across several channels at once. A subscription to a closed job platform, a couple of short consultations with different people, one person to rewrite your resume, another for interview coaching, several search strategies running in parallel. And if you then find the job yourself, which for someone earning 120,000 is entirely plausible, you're out $500 at most, and you've gained several independent views of your own market profile. 10,000 as a success fee works differently. It's a single bet on one consultant and one way of working. If that bet doesn't produce an offer, you don't lose money. But the distributed activity those same $500 could have funded is also something you never had. And yet 85% chose the second option. The gap between cold arithmetic and actual choice turned out to be more interesting than any answer to the question I formally asked. The longer I looked at the numbers, the more clearly I saw that the poll had measured something other than what I was asking. When I started looking at the profiles of the people who responded, the picture got more complicated than the percentages suggested. The people who chose the $10,000 option skewed heavily toward developers, middle managers, specialists whose actual income, based on what's visible publicly, is nowhere near 120,000 a year. They were answering a question that didn't directly apply to their own situation. And that's exactly why their responses are interesting. Not as market research, but as a mirror. They show what people think about a choice like this when the situation is hypothetical and therefore safe. Read that way, the result surfaces things that rarely come up in direct conversations about job searches. The first thing it surfaces is mistrust. Most of the people answering a question like this have at some point had contact with the career consulting market and came away unimpressed. That market really is full of people who take money up front, send a resume out across their database, and call it support through to an offer. The candidate pays, gets a series of template consultations, and ends up feeling processed without being moved anywhere in particular. When this pattern repeats often enough, a reflex forms. In any next conversation about payment, there's one answer: only for results. The logic is persuasive, but it hides an assumption that rarely gets checked. When someone agrees to pay only for results, they're assuming that the result is achievable and that getting there is someone else's job. In a job search, especially at the executive level, both halves of that assumption are often wrong. There's something else underneath the choice, and it's harder to say out loud. In conversations with candidates, I often hear a phrasing that sounds like a request for a service, but isn't really one. Find me a job is almost indistinguishable from tell me I'm still worth what I was worth 3 years ago. The second sentence doesn't get said, but it's there in the conversation from the first minute, and an attentive listener can hear it. A willingness to pay $10,000 for an accepted offer is, in large part, a willingness to pay for that second sentence, not for access to vacancies, but for confirmation that the market is still willing to take you, that your value hasn't collapsed over the years you spent in one place. Someone in the middle of a search is usually carrying a mix of exhaustion, anxiety, and self doubt. The idea of handing responsibility for the outcome to someone who understands the market better looks rational from the inside. But if you pull the choice apart, there's a much older biology at work than we tend to assume. Robert Sapolsky, in his book Behave, describes how in primates a threat to status activates the same stress circuitry as a threat to physical safety: cortisol, a search for reassurance, an urgent need to regain control. None of this is news. It's been well documented for a long time, and yet it keeps surprising us. When personal stakes are high, much of what we take to be cold calculation is actually playing out at the level of biochemistry. We know ourselves worse than we think, And part of that $10,000, in some sense, isn't being paid to the recruiter. It's being paid to the ancient part of us that needs to hear we're still all right. The wording of the poll contains a word that, on close reading, turns out to be much fuzzier than it looks. Accepted offer sounds concrete until you start asking which offer, for what role, at what company, with what compensation, how many months out. If a recruiter brings an offer with a 20% cut from your current salary, does that count as a result? What if the offer arrives 9 months later? What about an offer from a company you wouldn't have considered in a calmer state of mind? In the comments under the poll, these questions started coming up, but most of the people discussing them never actually reached an answer. Everyone had their own picture behind the word offer, and for many, that picture was vague. I often hear at the start of a conversation with a candidate the phrase, I want something better than what I have now. It rarely points to a formulated goal. More often, it's a symptom. The person feels that where they are no longer suits them, but hasn't yet done the work to figure out what exactly they have to offer the market, in what segment, on what terms, and with what odds. Paying a success fee for an offer in that state of mind means paying for the fulfillment of a wish you haven't yet put into words. And without those words, whatever offer shows up probably won't be the one worth paying for. There's another problem with the success fee model, more structural, and it rarely gets talked about. Paying for a result is assumed to mean paying for active work. So much effort, so much money. In career consulting at the executive level, that equivalence breaks down quickly. One phone call to the right owner at the right moment can close a position in 3 days. 100 calls, 10 interviews, and months of candidate handling can come to nothing. There are no guarantees here, not for the consultant, not for the client. The only thing to lean on is an average closure rate across a portfolio. A certain share of projects land, a certain share don't. For any single candidate, that number means almost nothing. On top of that, there's an adverse selection problem. Candidates who are genuinely rare on the market and whom several companies are already courting, as a rule, don't come to a consultant. They don't need an intermediary. What the consultant ends up with are the harder cases, and the expected effort on any given project runs high on average, even if some resolve quickly. There's another asymmetry at work here, and this one is psychological. When a result comes fast and looks as though it was solved in a couple of phone calls and a few edits to a resume, the thought of paying $10,000 meets internal resistance. The number doesn't match the visible effort. That behind those 2 hours lie years of building relationships with the owners the consultant is now calling, the client doesn't see, and strictly speaking, isn't obligated to see. A quick success reads as evidence that this wasn't worth paying that much for, and the client starts wanting to renegotiate after the fact. The obvious technical answer to all of this has been around for a long time. The deposit, the candidate places, say, $5,000 in escrow. The money sits there until the moment of an offer. And then one of two things happens. If an offer is accepted, the money converts to a fee. If no offer materializes within the agreed window, the money comes back. The mechanics are honest, the risk is shared. And I'm reasonably sure that most of the people who voted for the success fee wouldn't agree to this either. The reason is interesting, and it's not really about money. At the moment an offer arrives, the consultant psychologically disappears from the equation. The candidate has done 5 interviews, a case study, negotiated the terms, and by the end, the retrospective collapses into a simple story. I did all of this myself. Why am I paying? The work that was actually done before that point, choosing the right companies for this candidate, preparing for a conversation with a specific owner, calibrating expectations before they could curdle into a surprise at the negotiating table, all of that becomes invisible by the time the offer is accepted. In retrospect, it feels like part of one's own achievement, not someone else's work that ought to be paid for. This is a property of human memory, not of the market or the industry. And as long as memory works this way, any pay for results model in career consulting will be structurally unstable. Even if the consultant did flawless work, by the time the offer lands, the client no longer sees the work that led to it. The first question in all of this, I've come to think, isn't how should I pay for a job search? It's how should I think about a job search at all? The market of executives in private business, which is where I work, is built such that most senior positions never become public. They get filled through owners' networks, through referrals, through recruiters who know a specific person and a specific problem. A candidate who waits for the right opportunity to come and find them isn't losing to the competition, they're losing to time. While they wait, opportunities go to people who have stayed in conversation with the market all along, even when they weren't actively looking. The more productive stance is one where the executive works with the opportunity market themselves rather than outsourcing it as an order for a result. This isn't a rejection of the recruiter, it's an understanding of what a recruiter can actually do. A recruiter can bring opportunities within reach, but the work of evaluating them, calibrating expectations, and making the decision can't be handed off to anyone else, no matter how large the success fee on the table. This is roughly the logic behind topheads.pro, the platform I'm building right now. An executive appears on it anonymously. No public signals about looking, no upfront fees, no commission on placement. You control who sees your details and when. The platform's job isn't to place a candidate. Its job is to let you stay in conversation with the market without turning that conversation into a separate project with no clear ending. The poll turned out to be more useful than I'd expected, and its value wasn't in measuring preferences. It reflected what people in conversations about job searching usually don't say out loud: anxiety, mistrust, blurry expectations. It's sobering to see how much of one's own choice stays invisible from the inside. But there's nothing unusual in any of this. We're only human, and it's all workable, as long as we at least know where to look. If a choice like this ever lands on your desk, it's worth pausing for a second and asking the question the poll numbers nearly hide: what exactly am I buying? And do I know what the result I'm willing to pay for actually looks like? This was Mike Torchinsky. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. It was a longer thought than usual, and I appreciate you staying with it to the end. If it gave you something to turn over, pass it to someone it might be useful for. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so the next episode finds you on its own. Until next time.